Did you know that the population of New York State is about 19.8 million people, but that about 43% of those people, or approximately 8.5 million, live in New York City? That statistic would be significant enough on its own, but when we look at how many people live in New York City compared to the state's capital, Albany, the contrast becomes even more stark. In fact, less than 100,000 people, or 98,600 to be exact, live in Albany, making it only 1% the size of New York City. This might make you wonder, why isn't New York City the capital instead? Or simply, why is New York's capital so empty, especially when compared to New York City? Well, today on Across the Globe, we're going to be answering those questions. And to start, we're going to be diving back in time and looking at some good old-fashioned history. Reason number 1, historical differences, geography, and trade. One of the main reasons that New York City has a population that's so much larger than Albany's is because of some key differences between the two cities regarding geography and trade. Let's start by looking at New York City, which was founded in 1624, and specifically the city's geography. While many know that New York City is located right on the ocean and has two major rivers running through it, the East River and the Hudson River, which stretches for 315 miles throughout the state, what you might not know is that this city is also connected to the Great Lakes. In fact, New York City is linked to the lakes because the Hudson River and the Erie Canal, which serves as a gateway to the Great Lakes, are connected. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, these lakes, which consist of Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario, and stretch all the way to Minnesota, are all connected together and link to the ocean via the St. Lawrence Seaway. Because of this, they have been an important trade route throughout the region's history. If all this geography is getting confusing, don't worry. The main point is this: because New York City is intricately linked to the rest of the country via its waterways and because it's located on the ocean, this means that it's a great location for a port. As ports are incredibly important for trade and the international movement of goods, New York City's prime real estate means that it grew as a major trade hub and attracted a large population as a result. Looking at Albany, while it is located on the Hudson River, which we've already identified as a major trade channel, it's significantly more inland than New York City. To be exact, it's located about 150 miles north of the city. This inland location means that Albany does not share New York City's characteristic as being an international port city, which has, in comparison, stifled its population growth as a result. Reason number 2, historical differences. Immigration. The strategic coastal location of New York City has not only made it a great place for trade throughout its history, but it also became an ideal entry point to the U.S. for immigrants. The city's harbors and ports, for instance, were and continue to be directly accessible from Europe and other parts of the world, in contrast to Albany's location in upstate New York. If you think back to your history lessons, for instance, you'll probably remember that Ellis Island, located near the iconic Statue of Liberty, served as a major gateway for immigrants during the 19th and early 20th centuries. This influx of immigrants wasn't small. In fact, they significantly contributed to New York City's population explosion. During the 35-year period between 1855 and 1890, for instance, New York City saw a significant influx of immigrants, with around 8 million people arriving from Europe. To put this into perspective, remember that the current population of New York City is approximately 8.5 million, and once these immigrants arrived in New York City, many of them stayed due to the city's vibrant economy that was fueled by industrialization. What's more, as New York City's population increased, the city sought out ways in which they could support this expansion. For instance, the development of infrastructure like the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, which was built between 1869 and 1883, facilitated population growth as it meant that residents could spread out amongst New York City's boroughs. In contrast, Albany did not experience anywhere near the influx of immigrants that New York City did. A big part of this is due to the same thing we mentioned before, its inland location. meaning that it developed on a smaller scale rather than becoming a global melting pot like New York City. And in fact, its location was a big part of why it was named the state's capital in 1797, as its location on the Hudson made it a prime military and trade location. Reason number 3, modern-day growth. While New York City's history is an important part of its growth, there's another factor that explains its massive size when compared to Albany. Put simply, New York City had a head start on Albany's population growth that it never quite managed to catch up to. To understand what I mean by this, let's look at the city's populations over time. Starting back in 1800, for instance, Albany's population was 5,300. That's not too shabby for a city at the time, but when compared to New York City, which at the time had a population almost 11.5 times the size of Albany's, with 60,500 people, it is pretty small. By 1850, Albany's population had reached a respectable 50,800, but New York City had exploded to a massive 515,500, which was 10 times the size of Albany. By the 1900s, the difference had become even more pronounced, with Albany having only slightly less people than what it has today at 94,200, and New York City having a population that was 36 times that at 3.4 million. Mathematically speaking, by this point it was just too hard for Albany to ever reach the population of New York City. Reason number 4, present-day industries. No conversation about these cities' histories would be complete without a look at where they stand in the present and why they continue to attract very different population sizes. Simply put, another key reason New York City has such a large number of people when compared to Albany is because of the scale of its industries. To give you a sense of what I mean by this, listen to this statistic. New York City's GDP is $1.6 trillion. That's just the city alone. For some context, the state with the largest GDP, California, has a GDP of about $3.59 trillion. That means that a single city alone has a GDP that's almost half of the GDP of the state with the highest GDP in the nation. Furthermore, the state with the second highest GDP in the US, Texas, is about $2.36 trillion, meaning that NYC has a GDP that's about 68% of the entire state of Texas. In contrast, Albany has a GDP of only $80 billion. That's not too shabby, but it's practically microscopic when compared to New York City, and in fact, it's only 5% of New York City's GDP. So what does all this mean for the populations of these two cities? Well, simply put, New York City has a much larger economy and can employ a lot more people than Albany can, contributing to its larger population. In fact, New York City has one of the strongest and most diverse economies out of any city in the world. While it may be known as the home of the New York Stock Exchange, there are other very powerful industries here as well. For instance, in addition to finance, there's technology, media, fashion, healthcare, and food and beverage industries, among others. To make this difference clearer, looking at New York City's finance industry, for instance, it employs over 330,000 financial service workers, which is over 3 times Albany's population alone. Tech, which is another major industry in New York City, has 291,000 workers who contribute over $124.7 billion in economic output. In contrast, Albany's major industry is government, which employs about 25% of the local workforce. While that's a significant proportion, when we do the math, it only amounts to about 25,000 people, which is less than the number of people in 1 square mile of New York City. However, it's not just tech and finance that demonstrate the contrast between New York City's employment statistics and Albany's. In fact, another big industry in New York City is the creative sector. Known as a world-class cultural hub, New York City's creative economy, which includes industries like theater, arts, advertising, and publishing, employs about 300,000 people and generates about $110 billion of economic activity. Altogether, the creative sector accounts for 13% of the city's total economic output. But what's more, a massive 12% of all creative jobs in the entire US are located in New York City. While Albany has an arts and culture scene, it's significantly smaller than New York City's and attracts fewer people as a result. For example, the entire Albany region only has about 35,000 creative workers. And while that may be a lot given its size, when we're looking at the scale of the numbers alone, those 35,000 in contrast to New York City's 300,000 is glaringly different. Reason number 5. Educational institutions. While employment opportunities play a big role in attracting individuals to a given area, educational opportunities are another. As a result, another factor that explains New York City's significance is its educational institutions. While many know New York City for world-famous universities including Columbia University and New York University, or NYU, those aren't all the city has. In fact, New York City has a whopping 120 different colleges and universities. Considering that a lot of those who attend these universities end up staying in the area afterwards to work, you can see why this would be a significant factor contributing to the city's growth. Albany, by contrast, has 12 colleges and universities in the area. And while that's by no means insignificant, when we look at the numbers alone, it does mean that there are going to be fewer people there as a result. Now, we've looked at a lot of different economic and social factors that have led to the difference in population between these two cities. But one thing we haven't looked at yet is the physical difference between the two cities. Reason number 6. Square mileage. The final reason that Albany has so few residents compared to New York City is simply because it's a smaller city geographically. For instance, New York City is made up of 5 different boroughs: Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island. Altogether, the land area of the city is about 469 square miles, including 304 square miles of land and 165 square miles of water. To give you some context on how big that is, it would take you a little over 20 hours to bike across that land at a rate of 15 miles per hour. Or, considering that a football field is about 0.03 square miles, then those 304 square miles would be over 10,100 football fields all lined up. Albany, by contrast, is significantly smaller, at 21.4 square miles. Going back to our analogies, that would take a little under an hour and a half to bike across, and would only be 713 football fields compared to New York's 10,100. So what does this have to do with the population differences between the two cities? Well, simply put, New York City's landmass is 14 times the size of Albany's, so there's more space for people there. And no matter how tall you build buildings, there's only so many people who can fit in a given area. What about why nobody lives in these 10 empty capital cities?